For nearly 6 months, investigators have searched for one answer. What happened to Nancy Guthrie? The evidence has been collected. The neighborhood has been searched. Federal agents have spent months following leads. Yet, despite one of the largest investigations in recent Arizona history, no suspect has been publicly identified, no arrest has been made, and Nancy remains missing. Now, the investigation has taken an unexpected turn. It is not because of newly discovered DNA. It is not because of surveillance footage. It is because of 2 letters. Letters that claimed Nancy was alive. Letters that demanded millions of dollars. Letters that later claimed she had died. For months, only fragments of those messages were known. Investigators confirmed they existed, but the public never saw their complete contents. That changed when nearly the full text of both ransom notes became public, giving investigators, journalists, and former FBI experts their first opportunity to analyze every sentence together. What they found was surprising. The letters do not read like ordinary ransom demands. Instead, they contain repeated contradictions, unusual wording, and strange choices that have led experienced investigators to ask a different question. What if getting money was never the real objective? That possibility has renewed interest in one of the most confusing cases of the year. To understand why these letters matter so much, we first need to go back to the night Nancy disappeared. Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home during the early morning hours after what investigators described as a violent encounter. Blood evidence found outside the residence indicated that she had suffered significant injuries before being taken away. Within days, local television stations began receiving anonymous ransom letters. The first message claimed Nancy was still alive. It demanded $4 million in Bitcoin. The writer warned that the payment had to be made before a strict deadline. If the deadline passed, the demand would increase to $6 million. If the final deadline expired, Nancy would be killed. At first glance, it sounded like a classic kidnapping for ransom. But almost immediately, experienced investigators noticed something unusual. The letters were not sent directly to Nancy's family. They were sent to media organizations. That decision alone raised difficult questions. In genuine kidnapping cases, the person demanding money usually wants to establish private communication with the victim's family. Every unnecessary person who becomes involved increases the risk of being identified. Sending the letters to television stations guaranteed something else. Police would learn about them almost immediately. That made many investigators wonder whether publicity itself was part of the plan. Then came the second letter. Instead of demanding more money, the writer completely changed direction. The message claimed the kidnappers had not understood Nancy's medical condition. It stated they never intended to hurt her. According to the letter, Nancy died shortly after being taken and was buried somewhere in nature. The writer even apologized. The tone was completely different from the first message. Instead of making threats, it sounded almost sympathetic. Instead of demanding payment, it appeared to offer an explanation. That dramatic shift immediately caught the attention of investigators who specialize in behavioral analysis. Among them was retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente, who spent years studying violent offenders and analyzing written communications from criminals. When Clemente reviewed the wording line by line, he noticed something that most people would never recognize. The problem was not simply what the letter said, it was how they said it. Certain phrases appeared overly formal. Others repeated information that did not need repeating. Some sentences contradicted previous statements made only a few lines earlier. To experienced behavioral analysts, language can reveal far more than the writer intends. People under stress often expose themselves through word choice, sentence structure, repetition, and inconsistency. Sometimes those details reveal education level. Sometimes they reveal emotional state. Sometimes they reveal whether more than one person was involved. And sometimes they reveal motive. That is exactly why investigators continue examining every sentence of these letters months after they were written. Because if the writer accidentally revealed something about themselves, those clues could become just as valuable as fingerprints or DNA. There is another reason these letters remain important. As of today, federal investigators have not publicly identified the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. The case remains active. Every piece of evidence still matters. Every inconsistency deserves another look. For Nancy's family, these letters may represent the last direct communication from whoever knows what happened that night. For investigators, they may contain the mistakes that eventually identify the person behind them. And for the public, they have created a mystery that grows more disturbing with every new detail. In the next part, we will examine the first ransom letter sentence by sentence. Former FBI experts believe several lines contain major contradictions that no experienced kidnapper would normally make. If they are correct, those mistakes may reveal far more about the author than the author ever intended. The first ransom note begins with a sentence that seems ordinary. "Hello, Savannah." At first, there is nothing unusual about it. But according to former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, those two words immediately stand out. Professional kidnappers rarely personalize a ransom demand this way. Their focus is simple. They want money. Every unnecessary word increases the risk of making mistakes. Instead of getting directly to the demand, the writer begins with what almost sounds like a greeting. That alone does not prove anything. But it is only the beginning. The next sentence reads, "We have your mother, Nancy." Again, nothing seems strange until you slow down and examine every word. Savannah already knows Nancy is her mother. A typical ransom note would simply say, "We have your mother," or "We have Nancy." Instead, the writer combines both. According to behavioral analysts, unnecessary repetition can sometimes reveal how a person thinks while under stress. It may suggest they are trying too hard to sound convincing rather than communicating efficiently. That pattern continues throughout the letter. The writer says Nancy is safe but scared. Again, that information is almost obvious. Anyone kidnapped in the middle of the night would be terrified. Yet the author keeps adding details that do not help accomplish the apparent goal of collecting money. The next sentence promises Nancy will be released once payment is received. Again, this is standard in almost every ransom demand. But the writer adds another unusual statement. They claim Nancy will be held for a maximum of 7 days. That sounds straightforward until investigators compare it with the deadlines listed later in the same letter. Those deadlines actually extend beyond 7 days. In other words, the writer contradicts their own timeline before the letter is even finished. Behavioral analysts pay close attention to contradictions like these. Professional kidnappers usually prepare carefully. If they are motivated by money, every instruction must be clear. Confusing deadlines create uncertainty and reduce the chance of getting paid. Then comes another detail that investigators found interesting. The ransom demand was made in Bitcoin. That alone is no surprise. Cryptocurrency has become increasingly common in extortion cases because it can be transferred quickly and it is more difficult to trace than traditional bank payments. But the wording inside the letter raises additional questions. Instead of simply referring to dollars, the writer reportedly used the abbreviation USD. Former investigators say that choice is unusual in ordinary American conversation. Many Americans simply say dollars. Using USD could mean nothing at all. It could also suggest someone accustomed to international financial terminology, or someone attempting to sound more educated, or someone using translation software. None of those possibilities can be confirmed, but each one becomes another small clue. And in complex investigations, small clues sometimes become important. The instructions continue. The writer claims Nancy will be released within 12 hours after payment is received. Then they add another phrase. She will be returned to a safe drop-off location back in Tucson. That wording immediately attracted attention. If the kidnappers were actually holding Nancy far away, why announce it? Experienced investigators often assume criminals avoid revealing information about distance, travel time, or location unless there is a specific reason. Some experts believe statements like these may have been intended to mislead investigators rather than describe reality. Whether that interpretation is correct remains unknown. But once again, the language raises more questions than answers. Then comes the threat. If payment is not received by the final deadline, she will be killed. Notice something important. The sentence does not say, "We will kill her." Instead, it uses passive language. She will be killed. To most readers, those two sentences sound almost identical. To behavioral analysts, they can suggest something different. Active language accepts responsibility. Passive language sometimes creates psychological distance. It separates the writer from the action being described. That distinction alone cannot identify a suspect, but it becomes meaningful when combined with everything else inside the letter. The author then writes, "Your mother is aware of this, and her life is in your hands." Again, the wording shifts responsibility. Instead of placing blame on the kidnapper, the sentence suggests Savannah's decisions will determine whether Nancy survives. Behavioral experts often describe this as projection. The writer attempts to transfer responsibility away from themselves and onto the victim's family. It is another emotional technique commonly seen in manipulation. Then the letter reaches what may be its most revealing section. The writer says, "You will not be able to contact me from here on out." For most readers, that sentence passes without notice. For behavioral analysts, it may be one of the most important lines in the entire letter. Throughout both messages, the writer repeatedly uses plural language. We are us. The letters create the impression that multiple people are involved. But suddenly, without warning, The writer switches to a single word. Me. One word. One possible mistake. If the writer truly represented a group, why change to the singular? Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente believes this could represent an accidental slip. In his view, it may suggest only one person actually wrote the letters. That interpretation remains only a professional opinion. It is not proof, but it illustrates why investigators examine every word with extraordinary care. The final lines become increasingly dramatic. There will be no negotiation. Do not play games. Law enforcement will not be able to help you. The sentences are short, forceful, almost theatrical. Instead of sounding like practical instructions from someone focused on collecting millions of dollars, they resemble dialogue from a crime movie. Behavioral experts caution against reading too much into style alone. However, when dramatic language appears alongside repeated contradictions, unnecessary wording, shifting pronouns, and inconsistent timelines, a larger pattern begins to emerge. By the time investigators reached the end of the first letter, one question had become impossible to ignore. Was this really written by an experienced kidnapper trying to collect ransom money? Or was someone attempting to create the appearance of a kidnapping while pursuing an entirely different objective? The second letter would only deepen that mystery. Instead of demanding payment again, the writer completely changed direction. The threats disappeared. The money disappeared. And what replaced them would leave investigators asking an even more disturbing question. The second letter changed everything. Until that point, investigators believed they were dealing with a traditional ransom case. Money had been demanded. Deadlines had been set. Threats had been made. Then, without warning, the entire story shifted. Instead of asking for payment again, the writer claimed something completely different. The letter begins with a sentence that immediately raises questions. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical conditions. Notice what is missing. Nancy's name. In the first letter, the writer repeatedly referred to her as Nancy or your mother. Now she has become simply her. Behavioral analysts often pay close attention when writers suddenly distance themselves from a victim. Sometimes it reflects emotional separation. Sometimes it reflects guilt. Sometimes it simply reflects a change in mindset. No single explanation can be proven. But the difference is significant enough that experienced investigators notice it immediately. Then comes another unusual phrase. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical conditions. Most people would simply say, we did not know she was sick, or we did not know she had medical problems. Instead, the writer chooses a far more formal expression. Physical conditions, fully grasp, seriousness. Throughout both letters, similar wording appears again and again. The language sounds unusually polished in some places, yet strangely unnatural in others. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente believes the writer may have been trying to sound more educated than they actually were. He also noted that some wording could be consistent with translated language or AI-assisted writing, although there is no evidence proving either explanation. The next lines become even more surprising. We never intended to hurt her. That was not our intention. The same idea appears twice, almost word for word. Behavioral experts sometimes describe this as overselling. When people repeatedly insist they did not intend something, investigators often ask why they feel the need to repeat themselves, especially when the available evidence points in another direction. Investigators had already reported signs of violence at Nancy's home. Blood evidence suggested she suffered injuries before being taken away. The first letter even threatened that she would be killed if the ransom was not paid. Now the second letter claims the opposite. The writer says they never intended to hurt her. Those statements cannot both be true. Either the threats were genuine, or they were never meant to be carried out. That contradiction became one of the most discussed aspects of the letters. Then comes perhaps the most important sentence in the entire message. She perished shortly after she was taken. Again, the wording sounds unusual. Most Americans would simply say, she died. Instead, the writer chooses the word perished. It is a word more commonly found in formal writing than in everyday conversation. But the wording itself is only part of what investigators noticed. The sentence says, she was taken. It does not say, we took her. Once again, responsibility disappears. The writer describes the event as though it simply happened. Behavioral analysts often look for this type of distancing language because people sometimes unconsciously separate themselves from actions they regret or fear admitting. That alone proves nothing. But it fits a pattern already developing across both letters. The writer continues, we believe it was heart-related. That sentence immediately creates another mystery. If the kidnappers were present when Nancy died, why would they say they only believed the cause was heart-related? Someone witnessing a medical emergency would usually describe what they actually saw. Instead, the wording sounds uncertain. Some investigators have suggested this uncertainty could indicate the writer was not present at the exact moment of death. Others caution that there is not enough public evidence to draw that conclusion. Either way, the sentence remains unusually vague. Then comes another phrase that immediately attracted attention. She's buried in nature now. Not buried in the woods. Not buried in the desert. Not buried outside Tucson. Buried in nature. It is an expression that sounds oddly abstract. Combined with words like perished and physical conditions, it reinforces the impression that the writer consistently chose language that felt different from ordinary conversation. Whether that reflects personality, education, translation software, or deliberate style remains unknown. The investigation has never publicly answered that question. The next sentence introduces another dramatic shift. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. Instead of threatening Savannah, the writer now appears to comfort her. That emotional change is striking. The first letter blames Savannah for Nancy's survival. Her life is in your hands. Now the second letter says the opposite. Nothing you could have done would have mattered. Two completely different emotional messages. Some behavioral experts believe this could suggest remorse. Others believe it could simply be another attempt to manipulate the victim's family emotionally. Both possibilities remain speculative. Neither has been confirmed by investigators. The letter ends with 4 simple words. We are truly sorry. It is an apology, one that few expected to see after a violent kidnapping. For some readers, it sounds sincere. For others, it feels calculated. Behavioral analysis cannot determine whether an apology is genuine, but it can examine why someone chooses to include one. If the goal had always been money, there would be little reason to send another letter after claiming Nancy had died. The writer could have disappeared forever. Instead, they contacted the media again. They abandoned the ransom demand. They abandoned the deadlines, and they replaced them with an explanation. That decision has become one of the biggest mysteries in the case. Why continue communicating after the apparent kidnapping had already failed? According to Jim Clemente, the answer may lie in motive itself. If money was never the primary objective, then the second letter begins to make more sense. Rather than continuing an impossible ransom negotiation, the writer may have been trying to explain themselves, or justify what happened, or perhaps make sure one specific person received the message. Those possibilities remain theories. They are not conclusions reached by law enforcement, but they illustrate why investigators continue studying every sentence months later. Sometimes criminals leave fingerprints, sometimes they leave DNA, and sometimes they leave something far more personal, their own words. In the final part, we will examine where the investigation stands today, why the FBI has still not identified a suspect publicly, and whether these 2 letters could ultimately become the evidence that solves the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Nearly 6 months have passed since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Despite thousands of investigative hours, countless interviews, forensic examinations, and assistance from multiple law enforcement agencies, one question remains unanswered. Who took Nancy Guthrie? The investigation is still active. Federal authorities have never announced a public suspect. No one has been charged in connection with Nancy's disappearance. And despite the intense media attention, investigators continue to keep many details confidential. That silence has led to growing speculation online. But experienced investigators often warn that silence should not be mistaken for inactivity. Many of the most important parts of a criminal investigation happen behind closed doors. Digital evidence is reviewed repeatedly. Phone records are compared. Financial transactions are analyzed. DNA profiles are checked against expanding databases. Witness statements are revisited months later to identify inconsistencies that may not have been obvious at the beginning. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the breakthrough investigators have been waiting for. The ransom letters remain one of those details. According to the FBI, not every ransom-related message received during the investigation has been dismissed as fake. Some letters have been identified as fraudulent attempts by unrelated individuals, while others have continued to be examined as potentially connected to the case. That distinction is important because it means investigators have not publicly ruled out the possibility that at least some communications came from someone with genuine knowledge of what happened. That uncertainty changes everything. If the letters are authentic, then the person who wrote them may have revealed valuable behavioral clues without realizing it. If the letters are not authentic, investigators still need to determine who sent them and why. Either answer could move the investigation forward. Another reason the case continues to attract attention is Savannah Guthrie's public response. Rather than giving up hope, she has continued urging anyone with information to come forward. She has also spoken directly to the person responsible, asking them to provide answers that could finally bring some measure of closure to her family. For investigators, those public appeals may serve another purpose. People who commit serious crimes sometimes continue following media coverage long after the crime itself. Behavioral experts have long observed that offenders may revisit news reports, monitor public reactions, or even insert themselves back into an investigation. That does not mean the person responsible has done so here, but it is one reason investigators continue paying close attention to every new communication connected to the case. There is also another possibility that cannot be ignored. What if the most important evidence has already been collected? Modern investigations often depend on technology that takes months to analyze. Digital devices can contain deleted messages. Cloud accounts may preserve records long after users believe they have disappeared. Location history, financial activity, internet searches, vehicle data, and surveillance systems can all be reconstructed over time. Unlike television crime dramas, these examinations rarely happen overnight. Complex forensic analysis often requires months of work before investigators are confident enough to act. That is why experienced detectives frequently ask the public for patience. An investigation may appear quiet even while critical evidence is still being processed. As of today, investigators have not publicly explained exactly how much information they have recovered. They have also not revealed whether the language used in the ransom letters has led them toward any particular suspect. Those answers remain inside the investigation. But one fact is clear. The letters have become far more than simple ransom demands. They are now evidence. Every unusual phrase, every contradiction, every repeated word, every change in tone. Each sentence may provide investigators with insight into the personality, emotional state, and intentions of the person who wrote them. Whether those clues eventually identify the offender remains unknown. History has shown that some of the most difficult criminal cases are solved years after they begin. Sometimes it happens because someone finally decides to speak. Sometimes a new witness comes forward. Sometimes advances in forensic science uncover evidence that could not be detected before. And sometimes a suspect makes one final mistake. That possibility is why investigators rarely stop reviewing evidence in unsolved cases. The smallest inconsistency can become the missing piece. For Nancy Guthrie's family, every passing day is another day without answers. For investigators, every unanswered question is another reason to continue searching. And for the public, this case remains a reminder that not every mystery is solved quickly. Some require extraordinary patience. Some require relentless determination. And some are solved only after one overlooked detail changes everything. Perhaps the greatest mystery is no longer where the ransom letters came from. It is why they were written the way they were. Were they the desperate attempt of someone seeking millions of dollars? Were they a carefully constructed distraction? Or did they reveal far more about the writer than the writer ever intended? Until investigators identify the person responsible, those questions will remain unanswered. But if history has taught us anything, it is this. In criminal investigations, the truth often hides in the smallest details. And sometimes the words people choose become the evidence that ultimately leads investigators straight to them.